Welcome everyone to Miss Wright's Read Aloud of the novel Pax. Today we are starting at chapter 10 with Peter. When we last heard from Peter, he had gotten his crutches made by Vola and had left her house to try to find Pax. Chapter 10. At the jog in the wall where he'd seen the deer, Peter stopped. There was blood already. He'd stumbled and ripped open the tender web of skin at the base of his thumb on a jagged splinter, and buckets of sweat. His arms trembled from the strain of lifting his weight for only these few minutes, his palms already raw on the rubber grips, and the throbbing in his right foot menaced like thunder. But none of that was what was wrong. It wasn't even the prospect of returning to his grandfather's grim house. He was going the wrong direction. He wheeled around. He stabbed at the ground and swung over it, stabbed and swung, until he planted himself in the doorway of Vola's barn again. He drew himself up tall. No. Vola's head snapped up. She shot him a warning scowl, but on her face Peter read a flash of something else, fear. I'm not going back, he said, more firmly. Whether you help me or not, I'm going to get my fox. Help you? Peter moved to the bench and hoisted himself up. Teach me. What you said about moving from my arms and getting strong. You learned how to get around on one leg. Teach me. You were a medic. Set my bone. Please. I'll do whatever you tell me to. He picked up the cider and drank it down to show his trust. Then I'll leave. But even if you won't help me, I'm going to get him. Vola put her hands on her hips and lowered her eye to him. A tamed fox? Set loose in the wild? You know he might be dead, don't you? I know, and it would be my fault. If he's dead, I need to bring him home and bury him. Either way, I'm going to go find my fox and bring him home. Vola studied Peter as if she was seeing him for the first time. So which is it? You going back for your home or for your pet? They're the same thing, Peter said. The answer sudden and sure, although a surprise to him. And you're going to do this no matter who tries to stop you? Because it's the right thing for you, at your core? Vola made a fist and thumped her chest. Your core, is that true? Peter waited before answering. Because this woman, maybe crazy, maybe not, had asked it as if it were the fate of the world depended on it. But the answer was the same as it would have been if he'd blurted it out. The answer would have been the same if he'd waited a lifetime to think it over. He thumped his own chest and felt the muscle of his heart leap. Yes, in fact, there's nothing else I know at my core. The woman nodded. Well, you're 12. That's old enough to know your own self, I expect. I'm not about to go messing with that. So all right. You'll help me? I'll help you. Vola extended her hand to shake. On 3 conditions. Chapter 11. My brother was born in my mother's second litter. They came early in the season. Last year, spring came late. Snow fell and did not melt. The earth stayed frozen beneath it. I lived nearby. I helped hunt. All day long, our parents and I searched for food because the kits were always hungry. But there was never enough. 2 of his littermates died on the same day. The farm, our mother urged, at the human's farm, There were always fat mice in the warm barn. In the humans' farm, there were eggs in the chicken coop. Our father would not risk it. When her third kit grew too weak to stand, our mother defied him. Runt raised his head and gave Bristle a pleading look. Bristle ignored it. She led the strongest of her new kits, my sister and me, to the humans' farm. Runt edged closer and pressed his nose into Pax's shoulder. Instantly the vixen lashed at his cheek, although Pax noted she did not use her claws. Runt dropped to the ground. The ground around the barn was cleared of snow by many footprints, human as well as animal as well as human. The air was rich with the smell of rodents. Our mother headed for a gap in the wooden boards near the base, with us a few tail lengths behind. Just before she reached it, steel jaws sprang out of the earth with such speed that the air snapped. Our mother screamed. The clamp held her front leg. The more she thrashed, the deeper the metal cut. She began biting at her leg to free it. Every time we tried to come near, she ordered us away. Our father appeared. He had followed our tracks. He chased my sister and me back to the brush and ordered us to stay there. Then he set to helping our mother. The scene she conveyed was of two foxes, bonded by both an old love and a new fear, the fear so terrible that their eyes rolled back in their sockets, so vivid that Pax could smell its sharp scent. Runt began to whimper, a piteous sound that made Pax want to comfort him, but Bristle warned him to keep away. A human came then, with a stick. Both our parents screamed at us to run home. We stayed. We saw. The human raised the stick, and in front of our eyes our mother and our father burst into blood and fur and shattered bones spattered over the snow. Runt whined and backed away toward the den again, and again Bristle stopped him. My sister and I could not leave our parents' bodies. Darkness fell, and the next day came, and still we hid in a pile of wood beside the barn. Finally we set out, but that night it began to snow. The snow blotted out all sound and scent. Lost, we crawled under a sweep of pine boughs, and I curled myself around my sister, who was so much smaller. In the morning, she died. When the snow stopped, I saw we had sheltered beneath the great pine at the top of our ridge. We had been within sight of our home. The image she shared then, her sister's frozen corpse at the base of the mighty pine, seemed to exhaust her. Why do we have no family, brother? Runt turned to Pax. Because of the humans, we have no family. Bristle turned her golden eyes on Pax, inviting a challenge. If he could have, he would have made her know every kindness of every day with his boy. But the hatred she had for humans was deep and fair. Instead, he offered his cheek in sympathy. Bristle turned away and ordered her brother back into the den. Chapter 12. You coming in? Or am I just holding the door open for the flies? Peter dropped his pack. He rebalanced himself on the crutches and stared at the log cabin. These trees grew here. It hadn't been a question, but Vola nodded and pointed uphill. Spruce, from the top of Mason's Ridge. Lincoln logs. Is that what you're thinking? Sort of, but it wasn't. Peter reached out to touch one of the logs. What would it feel like to make something so consequential? To cut timbers and watch them fall out of the clear blue sky and roll them down to a clearing, your hands sticky with sharp-scented pitch, and then lift them into place, notched and stacked over one another. Yes, just like toys that had been his favorite in kindergarten, the old set in the tall cardboard canister, and end up with a home. You built this? No, before my time. Now, come in. I don't have all day. Peter still didn't move. What are the conditions? You'd said you'd tell me when we got here. Vola sighed and stepped back onto the slab of granite that formed the front step, letting the screen door clasp shut. She picked up a jar of seeds, and a cloud of birds fluttered down from the trees to surround her. She filled a feeder that hung from a corner rafter before turning to answer him. Number 1, I don't want anyone coming around here. I live by myself for a reason. You write to your grandfather and tell him whatever it is to make sure nobody comes around here. Besides, it's only fair you let your family know you're not dead in a ditch somewhere. Peter reared back so fast he almost toppled over. The pain of the movement caused was searing, but he bit his lip. No, he'd come and get me. No. Condition number 1, non-negotiable. She scooped a few seeds from the jar and held out her palm. A chickadee left the feeder and settled on her fingertips. He pecked at the seeds, and when they were gone, she tossed him back into the air. She turned back to Peter. Number 2, you're going to tell me why you're carrying that bracelet. Peter looked down at his pack and felt his heart clench to protect what was so private. Why? Because I'm curious about you, and you can tell a lot about a soldier by what he carries into battle. But I'm not a soldier. I'm just going home. Is that so? Because it sounds to me like you're headed off to fight for something in a place where there's a war. But have it your way, you're not a soldier. Condition 2 is still this. When I ask you, you're going to tell me why you've brought that bracelet with you. Why that particular thing. The truth. That's the rule here. Agreed? Peter nodded. His right foot throbbed, and his left leg ached from the extra burden. His shirt was sweat-soaked with the exertion of hobbling 100 yards from the barn, but he stood his ground. And number 3? You're going to help me with something. I see that look. Don't worry. It's just a project needs a second person, that's all. But I'm not ready to tell you what it is yet. She picked up his backpack. Inside. It's time to get you off that foot. And I suspect you're hungry, Mr. Not exactly running away from home. No bet, Peter. Suddenly Peter was starving. Still, he hesitated. He pivoted to look at the hills, which the sun was lightening to a smoky blue. Pax was out there. He was still so far away. Vola came up behind him. Peter sensed her raising a hand toward his shoulder and letting it fall back. I know what you're thinking, she said, but you're not fit to go yet. Inside, the cabin was bright and smelled faintly of smoke. Vola tapped a pine table and Peter sat. She draped a blanket over his shoulders, then left and came back with a plastic bag full of ice cubes. She propped his foot up on a chair and wedged the ice egg against it. With a washcloth, she cleaned the blood from his hand. Finally, she passed him a cutting board with a loaf of bread and a knife on it. Peter put it down. How long will it take? Depends on you. The woman pointed to the bread. What, you can't use your hands either? Slice that up. How long? You can go when you can hike over rough terrain and those crutches for 8 hours a day. 2 weeks, I guess. 6 slices. You don't understand. He won't survive. Vola lowered her head to glare at Peter. She yanked her thumb up at the wall behind him. Numbers 11. Peter twisted around. A jumble of index cards was thumbtacked to the wall. The Gulf Stream will flow through a straw, provided the straw is aligned to the Gulf Stream and not cross currents, he read out loud from the one that had 11 scrawled all over it. What's that supposed to mean? It means align yourself, boy. Align myself? Figure out how things are and accept it. You've got a broken foot. Broken. The deal is you stay until I say you're ready. I told you my conscience is stretched to its limit, so that's your choice. Stay here until I say, or go back to your grandfather's now. You change your mind about that? No, but then accept it, eh? Now slice that Dableman bread. Peter started to argue, but then closed his mouth. He wasn't staying for any 2 weeks, but obedient and helpful was the safest play for now. He ducked his head and set to work cutting 6 thick, even slices of bread, while Vola slapped a chunk of peanut butter on an iron skillet and snapped up a flame beneath it. Without turning around, she motioned to a shelf above the counter. Pick yourself something. Canning jars, stacked 3 deep, gleamed like a rainbow of liquid jewels along the length of the shelf. Peter read the plain block letters on the labels. Cherries, plums, tomatoes, blueberries, apples, pumpkin, pears, green beans, beets, peaches. Braids of dried garlic and chili peppers hung beside the shelf. You grow all this? Vola nodded, her back still to him. The trees that run along your stone wall are in bloom. What are they? Nearest the wall? Peaches. He pointed to a jar at the end. Peaches, please, ma'am. Vola opened the jar and handed him a fork. There's a twig in it or something. Vola reached into the jar, popped the stick into her mouth, sucked the syrup off, pitched the stick over her shoulder into the sink, and rolled her eyes. Lord! Cinnamon! Eat! She gathered the bread she'd cut with a curt nod of approval. Cheddar or Swiss? Cheddar, I guess. Vol straightened. You guess? You don't know? Peter shrugged and speared a peach chunk. It tasted as bright and golden as it looked. Vola seemed to be working up a whole lot more to say about the cheese issue, but she pressed her lips together, spun around on the point of her wooden leg, and clumped back out the door. She came back in with a slab of cheese a moment later and set to work wordlessly making sandwiches. Peter heard them sizzle as she pressed them into the hot skillet. He surveyed the cabin. It wasn't big, but it didn't feel cramped either. Sunlight flooded through the clean windows, washing the long walls in a honey glow. 2 blue-striped armchairs flanked a stone fireplace, and a trunk backed with books served as a table between them. Small barrels held lanterns, and more hung from the beams. There were photos on the mantel, a few paintings on the walls, and a basket of yarn beside the armchair. Through the open door by the fireplace, Peter saw the corner of the bed, neatly made with a yellow checked quilt. It was a surprisingly normal home for a crazy person, yet something was missing. Peter noticed how quiet it was. Silent, actually, except for the bird calls outside and the butter sputtering in the skillet. But that wasn't it. Not exactly. Hey, he said as it dawned on him. You don't have electricity. The woman flipped the sandwiches. As far as I know, that's not a crime in this country. Not yet, anyway. Peter tried not to think about what he would miss without electricity, but there were too many things to count. He chased out the last bit of peach, the fork rattling against the empty jar. Vola's back was still turned to him, so he lifted the jar to drain the last drops of syrup. But wait, how'd you get the ice? I've got a refrigerator out on the porch. It's gas, so is the stove and the water heater. I've got everything I need. She set 2 blue plates down on the table. Peter's mouth watered at the smell of food, but he waited. Vola wasn't finished, he sensed. I have more than everything I need, Vola sat. I have peace here. Because it's so quiet? No, because I am exactly where I should be, doing exactly what I should be doing. This is peace. Eat." Peter bit into his sandwich. The cheese was hot and runny all the way through. The bread was fried crisp and brown. He broke off a corner out of force of habit and was about to reach down with it, but then he remembered. There was no fox under the table. He wondered if Pax was missing him as much as he missed his fox right now. "Don't you get lonely out here?" "I see people. Bea Booker, the librarian. Robert Johnson, bus driver. I see people." She got up, brought the frying pan over, and slid another sandwich into his plate. "Eat." Peter ate, thinking about what she'd said about peace. When he'd finished, he'd licked the buttery crumbs from his fingers. "What do you mean, you're doing exactly what you should be doing? Do you work?" "Of course I work. The garden is 1/2 an acre, and the orchard is twice that size. I'm planting beans and okra today. Maybe get to replacing the seal on the well pump. There's always plenty to do here." "But you don't go to a job? Make any money? How do you buy things? Like all the tools in the barn, like," he waved around the cabin, "all your stuff." Vola hoisted herself onto the counter and held out her wooden leg and rapped it with a spatula. "My country pays me a little blood money every month in exchange for my leg." She dropped the spatula into the sink and shook her head. "A Dobbleman deal. Turns out my leg wasn't all that valuable to them. Wish they told me before they sent me scouting in a minefield. Because I liked my leg. It was a good leg. Not much to look at maybe, but it worked fine. It ran me clear into the next town when Deidre Callanan and I set fire to her father's woodshed in 6th grade, and it kicked out the smile off Henry Valentine's face when he tried to grab my butt the next year. I could go on. The leg is a very big price to pay. Every day, every single day, I wish I'd had it back." "How come you don't get one that's more—" The woman stuck her leg out again and tugged up her cuff to assess the wooden post. "Oh, they gave me a prosthetic. A complicated piece of work. Scared the devil out of me whenever I looked down. So I made my own. It's heavy and it's clumsy, but I did some terrible things in the war. I figure I deserve to drag something around." "You threw it away? A prosthetic leg, and you just threw it away?" Peter couldn't help imagining the shocked look on some garbage collector's face. "Of course not. I wear it, sometimes. Right now it's in the garden, on the scarecrow. Scares the devil out of the crows too, apparently." She dropped off the counter and jammed a battered straw hat onto her head as if she'd suddenly remembered this garden of hers. "I'll be back before dark. The outhouse is just beyond the 2 cedars, and there's a tub in the kitchen. Clean up. The porch is yours. Actually, you'll have to share it with Francoise. Keep that leg elevated." "Who's Francoise?" Again Vola's short bark of laugh startled Peter. She tipped her head toward the back door, which led out to a screened porch. "He's probably napping right out there, lazy old thief." She crossed to the door, looked out, and then nodded. "Come see." Peter levered off the chair and onto the crutches. Vola held the door open and waved toward a wood bin. Peter saw a pair of dark-ringed eyes peering out at him. He cocked his head to get a better view. The raccoon cocked his head back. Francoise Villain, named after one of the most famous thieves in history. The original was a poet as well as a thief, and such a charmer that every time they arrested him, some admirer pardoned him. Peter grinned. He crouched to get a better look. "Hey, Chuck, Chuck, Chuck," he called softly, the way he always greeted Pax in the morning. The raccoon eyed him lazily for another moment, and then seemed to decide he wasn't interesting and flopped over and closed his eyes. "Is he wild or tame?" Vola waved off the words as if they were gnats. "I leave the porch door open. He visits when he wants to, and he's fine company. I feed him, but I don't have to. He stays fat enough on his own." We've come to a little agreement about the chicken coop. He leaves the girls alone, and I scramble him up an egg now and then. He's a companion. That's the best word. She pointed to a beam spanning the ceiling. Tomorrow you can do some pull-ups, but today stay off the leg and keep it elevated. Above your heart is best. She nodded to the refrigerator. Keep icing it on and off. I want the swelling down so I can set that bone tonight. Mix a spoonful of willow bark in water every few hours for pain. Peter nodded, then dropped into a hammock hanging from the beams, exhausted. Vola started to leave, but paused in the doorway and turned around to study him. She crossed her arms over her chest, an unreadable expression on her face. What? Just wondering, she said. You staying out here on the porch. What do you suppose that makes you? Wild or tame? Chapter 13. When Pax awoke, it was late afternoon. The ache that had cramped his belly the past few days was worse, and when he tried to rise, he lost his balance for a second, his muscles trembling. He surveyed them for injury with a distant curiosity. Once, when he'd been ill, his boy had forced a pill down his throat. Afterward, his senses had been dulled and his reaction slowed. He felt the same way now. He dropped to the cool dirt and watched as below, Gray and his mate emerged from their rest to scent the air, relieve themselves, and set out for food. Bristle sprang out from the den beside him, stopped only to order her brother to stay behind, then trotted off to hunt also. On the day he'd gotten into the car with the boy, Pax had sensed the tension and refused his morning kibble, so it had been 3 full days since he'd eaten. Although Pax had never seen death, he understood it awaited him if he did not find food. This thought produced no sense of urgency and drifted away. A second thought, however, that he must find his boy and see him safe, stirred in him to rise again, bracing himself on his forelegs before straightening his haunches. After a moment his head cleared. He wandered past the dens Bristle and Runt shared. There he smelled caches of game buried in the soft earth, but they were marked with powerful scents, so he did not dig them up. Farther out, a few gnawed-over carcasses were discarded to be scoured clean by lower-ranking scavengers. Pax began to poke through the carrion. Only the tail end of the marsh rat held any meat at all. Too ragged and gristly even for the crows, it was crawling with maggots. Pax lowered his head to the remains. He opened his jaw, but the smell sent him reeling back. He staggered back a few steps and buried his muzzle in a patch of clover, chewing the sprouts to cleanse the foul odor from his sensitive nasal passages. He swallowed them and then began to feed tentatively. The act of eating was a comfort to his shrunken belly, although a false one. The clover wouldn't strengthen him. After a few mouthfuls, the clear thought rose again. He must find his boy. Just then he heard something tear through the grass. Before his sluggish senses could respond, he felt a solid weight plow into him. Runt pounced on top of Pax, crowing at his successful ambush. But when Pax didn't move to shake him off, Runt began to examine him. Pax lay still while the smaller fox sniffed and licked him, too weak to waste energy batting him away. Unwell? Pax closed his eyes against the low glancing sunlight and did not respond. Runt bounded off and came back a few minutes later with a worm hanging from his jaw. He dropped it at Pax's paws. Pax shrank away, but the thoughts he had earlier surfaced again. He had to find his boy. He could avoid death if he ate. He picked up a worm and bit into it. Unused to the taste of live flesh. Pax retched and twisted away. Rent dug up another worm and dropped it in front of Pax, and this time Pax got to his feet and took a few steps before sinking back down. Runt followed and nudged him. Eat! Pax mustered as much dominance as he could. Leave! The younger fox gazed at the older one for a moment, then turned and trotted back to the grass. Relieved, Pax laid his head on his paws. He did not have the energy for resistance now. But Runt reappeared after a few moments, something round in his mouth. He dropped his gift and it broke open. Egg! The scent called up a sharp memory. Once when he was very young, Pax had found a hard white orb while exploring his human's kitchen counter. He batted at it thinking it was one of his boy's playthings. It rolled onto the floor and cracked open, spilling its delicious secret. Peter's father had come in while he was still licking the last drops and smacked him away. His flank had stung from the blow, but the egg had been worth it. Since then, Pax had managed an exploratory visit to the kitchen counter every time he was left alone, looking for more of them. A few times he'd gotten lucky. The quail egg Runt had brought was smaller, its speckled shell flecked with dry grass, and it smelled gamier than the ones his humans ate. But there was no mistaking it. Egg. Pax rose. Runt backed away to allow Pax to lap up the yolked prize. He licked the grass clean of every drop, then looked up, eager to express his gratitude. Runt was gone, but in a few moments he came back. 2 more eggs held carefully in his mouth. Pax devoured them. Runt left and returned twice more. Pax ate steadily until finally, 7 eggs swelling his shrunken belly taut, he dropped to the sandy apron in front of the dens and closed his eyes. Runt leapt onto a gnarled root above the dens. He drew himself up to his full height, and while Pax slept, the ragged little runt kept watch. That's the end of chapter 13. Thank you for joining me. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.